Hey, welcome back. This is Mrs. Frank, and I'm continuing my reading of Appleseed Farm by Emily Taft Douglas. We are now on section 2, chapter 5. We're right in the middle of the book, and this chapter is called Birthday Party. If you remember, it's Ada's birthday. Outside it was raining in earnest. Rainy days in Boston had been cozy, Ada thought, but who could feel cozy with greased paper windows and leaks between the logs where the moss stuffing had fallen out? Besides, the cabin was too small to hold Ned's noise, her mother's sadness, and her father's restlessness. Already Tom Bartlett was pacing the floor like a caged lion. "If you want it to rain in this forsaken county," he grumbled to Johnny Appleseed, "you have a drought for weeks. But if the earth is already soggy, you can count on it to pour every day." Johnny Appleseed did not say anything. He took a small black book from his knapsack and squatted down beside the hearth. "Do you care if I read out loud?" he said. "Some folks don't mind if I read a little to them." Tom Bartlett stared without answering, and Mrs. Bartlett, busy with her mending, did not pay much attention. Johnny Appleseed opened his book and began to read. His voice was one which Ada never forgot. It had the roar of the wind and the sea at times, and again it was as gentle as a rustling breeze. Tom Bartlett stopped his pacing to listen, and Mrs. Bartlett's fingers lay idle in her lap. Ada and Ned edged up close to him to hear better. It was the familiar 23rd Psalm which he was reading. When he was through, Mrs. Bartlett wiped her eyes, but she looked less sad than usual. The lines of bitterness on Tom Bartlett's face had faded. "What with hostile tribes and heat," he said, "I suppose those shepherds had as hard a time in the Bible days as we settlers now have." "Harder," Johnny Appleseed answered. "They had a blistering desert to fight, while this is a rich garden country." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Most people have troubles. The wilderness is hard today, but when it's tamed, men will find new troubles. Your grandchildren will have their troubles too, I reckon." "Just think about how others have overcome their troubles kinda helps," Tom Bartlett said. "We're so everlastingly alone out here." "It takes faith now, as it did in the Bible days," Johnny Appleseed told them. "But you will have green pastures and still waters. You shall not want." "Do you think there's a living for us here?" Tom Bartlett asked. "I know it," said Johnny Appleseed. "You can make this land blossom like a garden. I've seen it happen all the way from Pittsburgh to the Illinois country. The frontier has been turning into rich farmland." "But it's not just a living I want," Mrs. Bartlett broke in. "Our children are growing up ignorant like all backwoods children. They don't have schooling, and they'll never have a chance in the real world." "Mary's father was a judge," Tom Bartlett explained, "and it's hard for her to see the children have so much less than she had." Johnny Appleseed looked at Mrs. Bartlett. "You've had schooling yourself, ma'am," he ventured. "Girls as well as boys get schooling back in Boston," she reminded him proudly. "I was just thinking," Johnny Appleseed went on, "that in a few years, when more settlers come, you'll have a school right here to give the trimmings to your children's training, or to ready this boy for college if you want. In the meanwhile, you'd make a first-rate teacher yourself." Mrs. Bartlett shook her head. "I gave them lessons before my baby took sick, but now it's beyond me." Johnny Appleseed eyed her solemnly. For the second time that day, he said, "God gives his children strength for every great need. Even I taught school a term when there wasn't anybody better for the job." Mrs. Bartlett flushed. "How can we ever hope to have a real school here?" she asked. "Schools follow settlers mighty fast," Johnny Appleseed told her, "especially when there are Boston folks like you to push the notion. I've seen it happen again and again. First there's only wilderness, wild beasts and Indians. Then a few families try out the land. They make good farms, and that draws other settlers. They have corn and wheat, and sometimes orchards." Tom Bartlett raised his head at this point like a threatening bull, and Johnny Appleseed, watching him from the tail of his eye, hurried on. "Soon they have crops to trade, and one fine morning they will have a little store sprouted up like a mushroom overnight. Then the mothers start planning for a school. I've seen it happen up and down this frontier land." Mrs. Bartlett put her work aside. She was watching Johnny Appleseed now as if he were a strange new creature just come within her sight. "You sow, but you never reap," she murmured. "Didn't you have a home and orchard of your own?" He nodded. "Yes, I had both of them once, long ago." "That was in Boston," Ada broke in, "1,000,000 years ago." Johnny Appleseed chuckled. "No, but I was born in Boston 2,000,000 years ago by your count. It's easy to remember because I was born within sight of Bunker Hill in 1775, the year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. But I got the woods in my blood, and as soon as I was grown, I began to follow the Indian trails. Where Pittsburgh now stands was frontier. I settled there and built a house. It was stone and logs with 4 rooms and a fireplace at each end of the big room." "That wasn't a house," Mrs. Bartlett declared. "That was a palace." "But you've not heard the best of it," Johnny Appleseed boasted. "I had a farm and an orchard. That was the wonder of the wilderness." "Then why did you leave?" asked Mrs. Bartlett. Johnny Appleseed thought for a moment. Then he answered, "It was the covered wagons and the settlers going west." "You grew restless?" Tom Bartlett nodded. "No, that wasn't it," Johnny Appleseed said. "I grew sorry for the travelers. They were so needful of comforts when they came to my house." Johnny Appleseed went on to tell how so many people stopped for a bite to eat or for lodging that his neighbor said he ran a free tavern. "Poor, bedraggled creatures they came," he said, "the men and older children toiling along the roads, and the horses and cows, and the great creaking wagons swarming with little ones. They were tired and dirty and hungry when they reached my door. But I don't have to tell you how they came," he added. "Likely you don't," Tom Bartlett agreed. Ada watched Johnny Appleseed's face light up as he told how he helped those poor travelers. Many of them, he said, had not had a fair meal since they left their homes. "They smacked their lips over my good bread, fresh butter, and wild honey," he boasted, "but most of all they relished my apples. There was a cave nearby where I would store them and keep them fresh the year round. On cool evenings, the guests roasted apples at my hearth, and they always asked, 'When shall we ever taste another apple?'" Johnny Appleseed took a deep breath and began again. "That question led me to offer the travelers apple cuttings to start their own orchards, but as the years passed, I learned that the cuttings usually died before they could be planted. I learned other things, too, about how dreary life was on the frontier and how women dreamed of apple orchards like mine and never got over their disappointment when their cuttings died." Johnny Appleseed told the Bartletts how he planned to spread orchards in the backwoods. He planted several nurseries in Ohio and later some in Indiana. But for the settlers in the lonely parts, he said, seeds were the only answer, for seeds were a safe and handy way to carry the makings of an orchard. "Once I realized this," he declared seriously, "I was ready for my life work in the wilderness." "But what happened to your house?" Ada wanted to know. "Oh, that," said Johnny Appleseed. "Well, a poor widow woman with 2 daughters needed it. So when I found my job would be traveling, naturally, I turned it over to them." "You left your fine house and your orchard," exclaimed Mrs. Bartlett, "to help strangers in the wilderness?" "Some folks say it was foolish," the old man admitted. "Some folks say I was crazy to leave a good living in the East and peddle apple seeds out here. Well, maybe they're right. But I've been following the frontier for 30 years now. I help make the wilderness bloom. I help it to make it fit for settlers and their families." He turned toward Tom Bartlett. "If what you think is true, that orchards don't matter," he said, "why then, I've wasted my life." "Oh, of course they matter," Tom Bartlett admitted gruffly. "You do a good work." "Nothing gives folks such a home feeling as an orchard," Johnny Appleseed went on. "If you've started an orchard, you know you're settled, because you want to see it bear fruit. Then you start making the best of things. Besides, the apple is the king of fruits. Think of fresh apples in the fall and of roasted apples on a winter evening. Think of cider, apple butter, pies, tarts, jelly, and dumplings." He unrolled the list slowly, temptingly, for Tom Bartlett's benefit. There's a host of pleasures in that one fruit. And the orchard itself. Do you remember the blessed shade in the summer and the pink blossoms in the spring? My father's orchard, suddenly broke in Mrs. Bartlett. When I was little, the blossoms looked like fairyland. And when I was older, oh, Tom, do you remember the full moon shining on my father's orchard? We used to walk there and we thought that it was heaven. Pa, whispered Ada. Ma is smiling. Tom Bartlett looked at his wife. An orchard means that much to you, he asked. It would be like a little bit of home, she said. Tom Bartlett nodded. I've meant to have an orchard someday. In a year or so, I thought we might start one. Sometimes a year or two is too late, warned Johnny Appleseed. I've seen folks shrivel up in the wilderness. Women and children need beauty and pleasure, and, well, they need apples. He ended so solemnly that the whole family burst out laughing. Mrs. Bartlett said nothing, but her eyes were fixed on her husband. Please, Paul begged Ada. I've seen this little bag of seeds. He wanted to give me one, and I'd love it more than anything. And here's the family in front of the fireplace talking with Johnny Appleseed. I was only thinking of a birthday present, Johnny Appleseed apologized, for he did not want to be scolded again. She's 10 years old today, and that's the age for presents. Listen, Pa, urged Ned a second time. I'll take full care of the seedlings. Honest, it can count for my present to Ada, too. I meant to carve some doll furniture the way I did last year, but lately Ada has grown too old for dolls. Anyhow, birthdays seem silly in the wilderness. Tom Bartlett flushed. Everything but work seemed silly to me. I was afraid we'd perish out here, he explained to Johnny Appleseed. I was desperate, and I forgot to make the best of what we have. We were thinking of all we'd lost, his wife said, instead of what we have. Then suddenly she stretched out her arms to Ada, and Ada ran into them and cuddled up into her mother's lap as if she were a very little girl, instead of being 10 years old. It was quiet in the cabin. Outside the rain was pouring down, but to Ada, nestled in her mother's arm, the plop, plop, plop of falling rain had become a friendly sound. Once again, the cabin was a cozy place. Tom Bartlett, however, was wrestling with a new problem, and he finally burst out with a last objection. But we aren't charity folks. If orchard planting is Johnny Appleseed's work, he's got to be paid, and there's not a cent in this house. Johnny Appleseed quickly drove away the new gloom which threatened to spoil the evening. Lots of folks out here haven't any money, he said. If you want, you can write me a promise to pay later. That will suit us both. I haven't a need for any money right now. Tom Bartlett met his guest's eye. He knew that Johnny Appleseed must have said the same thing to dozens of other settlers, and that he never expected them to pay. He just said it to make people feel better about taking his gifts. But Tom Bartlett, with his eyes on the strange, kind man, promised himself that he would be different from the other settlers. He would pay his debt, and with interest. All right, he agreed out loud. It will be Ada's birthday present. Ada jumped up and flung her arms around her father's neck, and Ned shouted for joy. Johnny Appleseed wasted no time. He burrowed again in his knapsack and took out one of the deerskin bags for the birthday girl. It's my treasure, he told her. Take care of it, and you will have an everlasting treasure for yourself and for your children. But we don't know a thing about planting an orchard, Tom Bartlett exclaimed. Couldn't you stay over to help us get it started? That's what I was figuring to do, Johnny Appleseed beamed. I told Hawkeye that I'd have to stay until I got your seeds in. Ever since you banged on that table this noon, he chuckled, I knew you wanted an orchard. After that, Tom Bartlett threw off every care. He was like his old self again, asking riddles and telling stories. When he paused for breath, Johnny Appleseed carried on with his adventures. The tale Ada liked best was one about how he once spent the night in a snowstorm. The snow was coming down thicker than molasses, he told them. I couldn't see a foot ahead and had to find lodging right where I was in the forest. I'd poked around for shelter, and sure enough, I found one right on the path. It was a great hollow log. That's luck, thinks I. It's just the place to curl up for a fine winter's nap. The only trouble was I wasn't the first one with that notion. I found myself snuggling up to a great bear. Yes, sir, he had gone to sleep in that log for the winter. Now, friends, with all creatures, now I'm friends with all creatures, but I still like to choose my sleeping companions, so I jumped out pretty quick. It was such a wonderful evening that Ada wanted it to go on forever, but the smoke from the fire made her eyes drowsy, and it was way past her bedtime. Sometimes the voices about her grew dim, and sometimes she nodded. Suddenly she toppled over against her mother's knee. Ned's laugh boomed into her ear, and she heard her father saying, "The party's over." He picked her up in his arms and carried her over to the straw bed. Drowsily, as if from a long way off, Ada wondered where Johnny Appleseed would sleep. She heard Ned offer his shake-down, his bed, and the reply, "No thanks, I'm not used to a bed anymore. It's too soft for me. If you've got a spare blanket, I'll just roll up here by the hearth." "It's such a wonderful birthday," Ada murmured, though if anyone would have asked her why, she would have found it hard to explain. All she had to show for it were a pink bow and a small bag of seeds. And you can see that ends chapter 5, and I'm going to take a break, I think, for the rest of the day. I hear my family in the background. If you heard all those doors and footsteps, I think that sometimes they need me. So I will be posting more tomorrow. Maybe we can get the rest of the book read, and you can listen to it at your leisure. Take care, and we'll see you soon.